The Sonic franchise has a lot of characters, and that's not a bad thing. I'm so glad we're mostly past the Sonic stupid friends era of criticism that complained about the Sonic franchise having an extended cast. Honestly, I'd put the cast size on par with something like Spider-Man. You know, there'll be a character who drops out of existence for a while, and then suddenly they're important again. Norman Osborn was dead for like 15 years. Harry Osborn was in hell for 28. But while Spider-Man gets 8 books at the time of writing this to explore different aspects of his cast, Sonic generally gets 1, which can pose a problem when writers want to explore other characters. The different Sonic series have dealt with this in different ways. Fleetway, which usually featured a couple different stories per issue, took to giving certain characters their own self-titled segments, such as Tails, Knuckles, Amy Rose, or even a more general one titled Sonic's World. IDW occasionally does a mini-series dedicated to a certain character, but they've also done issues of their main series that either feature Sonic in a very diminished role, or even not at all so the story can focus on other characters. Archie's approach is what I want to focus on. Early on, the Archie series would feature multiple stories per issue, and a lot of the time they'd all feature Sonic prominently. In issue 4, they experimented with some single-page gags that didn't feature the Hedgehog. Issue 14 not only had a story that gave Tails center focus, but also gave us one focusing on Sally and Bunny. Issue 17 began an arc of stories in which Sally was the main character, which then gave way to her receiving her own miniseries, and opened the door to allow Tails and Knuckles to get the same treatment, with the Echidna of course being the only one successful enough to receive his own ongoing. However, starting in issue 13, this book starts doing the same thing, with Knuckles only making brief appearances that aren't relevant to the main narrative. Knuckles does not get to participate in the drug-laced Chili Dog arc. He only appears in an average of 2 pages for each of the issues involved in it. Then in issue 26, they'd start dedicating the B stories to different members of the Chaotix, specifically Mighty and Espio. I actually don't have a problem with the books being formatted like this, but it does indicate that there was an artistic desire to explore more of the world, and that they're working within the constraints given to do so. And when the Knuckles book was cancelled, the stories they wanted to tell now had to be condensed back into a single book. And this is the format the comic stuck with for some time. A main Sonic story, with backup stories frequently focused on Knuckles, or at least one where Sonic is a fairly minor character if not absent altogether. In 2005, Archie would begin publishing a second Sonic title, but it was Sonic X, which was wholly unrelated to what was happening in the main Archie continuity. But in 2009, the Sonic X book would come to an end, with it being replaced by another title, Sonic Universe. In the final issue of Sonic X, Ian Flynn writes, "This is the end of our friends' stories in Sonic X, but only for now. We'll be seeing them again one day." I mean, at this point we can only hope. This is the dawning of an entire Sonic universe. Each month we'll be bringing you thrilling stories from all over Sonic's world. Sonic Universe number 1 will finish the story you're holding in your hands as Shadow and Metal arrive on a whole new world. From there will be 3 more thrilling stories about Shadow and his special missions. Then in Sonic Universe number 5, we'll be uncovering mysteries with Knuckles. And that's not even all of the first year. There's a whole universe for us to explore. Won't you join us? Sonic Universe is perhaps the smartest idea in the history of the Sonic comics. And I want to talk about the strengths of this series, starting with Sonic Universe is best summarized as an ongoing anthology series that focuses on a single narrative for a period of 4 issues, before moving on to the next story. While I've long held the belief that there are several Sonic characters who could all support their own solo series, I do think if you only had one additional title to work with, I think one that gives you the chance to spotlight every character is the best option. Also, everyone has their own favorite Sonic character. Even casual fans have a more specific pick.
Who gives a It's Tails, I guess. I don't know.
But it's not even just the core concept of the book that makes it work. Even the choice to make each arc 4 issues is a perfect one. I think a lot of different miniseries struggle to find the perfect length. If you've seen my video on the 3-issue Princess Sally miniseries, you know a problem I highlighted is the fact the book doesn't have a lot of time to set things up, so nothing about its resolution feels earned. I suggested things that could be cut or how the narrative could be rearranged, but in retrospect, I think another option option would be to make the miniseries longer, give the events a little more time to breathe, examine some things in more detail. That's a series that was too short for its narrative, but on the flip side, a mini can also be too long. A mini I've talked about before and actually really like is Venom Lethal Protector, which ran for 6 issues. Now, this mini does have to not only tell a compelling story, but also has to set up Venom's new status quo in San Francisco. And the problems I'm going to talk about can be overlooked if you're reading from the Venomnibus, because it just lets you roll into the next arc. But like, when you're reading the series by itself, General Orwell Taylor and the jury show up and disappear halfway through the book. They're being set up for much later, but they don't have much to do with the story that's being told here. I actually omitted them from my summary of the series, and while that video was 2 years ago, and I'm sure I would write parts differently today, I probably still wouldn't include them because they're an aside that goes nowhere. The same issue also features Peter talking with Carl Brock, filling in some of Eddie's backstory, only for Spidey to basically say, "Interesting, too bad it's not relevant." Basically, there's some bits, specifically in issues 2 and 3, that could have been trimmed to help the story flow better and not get caught in what are ultimately tangents. 4 issues, however, is the perfect length for the type of stories being told in Sonic Universe. And to demonstrate why, we're going to use this. You may remember this from your middle school English class, I guess, but this is Freytag's Pyramid, a narrative structure proposed by German novelist and playwright Gustav Freytag in his book Die Technik des Dramas, or Technique of the Drama. There are 7 points to this. There's the exposition, which is the setup for the story, which gives way to the inciting incident, which is the event that kicks off the plot. Then there is the rising action, where the tension ramps up until we hit the climax. The thing that stands out to a lot of people is that generally when people refer to the climax of a story, they're referring to something near the end, while this places it in the middle. Then from there we have the falling action, which leads to the resolution, which is then followed by the denouement, a French word meaning unknotting, which refers to the story threads being wrapped up. Some things I need to address. First, Gustav Freytag sucked for all the reasons you'd imagine a 19th century playwright would, and more.
I think it's good that he died.
Second, this isn't even actually Freytag's pyramid as he introduced it. His looks more like this, with only 5 points instead. An introduction, the rise, the climax, the return or fall, and instead of a resolution, we have catastrophe. This is because Freytag made this with tragedies in mind. Like, if you look at his version, you can easily map something like Macbeth onto it. The version we have today is a more generalized version. And I've seen arguments that this narrative structure is outdated, and in some ways it may be. You probably just thought of some things you like that don't fit this at all. But I also always thought it's important to never apply rigid rules to any form of self-expression. They're important to learn about because it helps you learn how to break down your own work and analyze the works of others. And then once you have a mastery of it, you figure out how to effectively break those rules. This is a very long-winded way to say, even though this is a nearly 200-year-old narrative structure, and the way we tell stories has developed since then, if it helps you structure your writing and helps you understand a story better, it's still useful. And for my purposes, it's very good for demonstrating how Sonic Universe effectively uses its issues. I doubt anyone actually used it in the writing of these stories, but it helps me explain my point. To demonstrate this, we'll be using the 5th arc of Sonic Universe, the Tails Adventure. The first issue covers the exposition, the inciting incident, and sometimes a little bit of the rising action. The exposition for Sonic Universe is usually pretty easy. They're working with an established cast in a world that's already been explored quite a bit, so really all they need to do is set up this specific situation. In this story, Tails takes Antoine and Bunny to Coco Island so that those two can finally have their honeymoon. It's also quickly established that they're not alone on the island. We get some character building, in some cases literally, and we set up Antoine and Bunny's dynamic. The inciting incident is then the Battlebird Armada attacking our group, with the rising action being Bunny and Antoine being captured while Tails is confronted by Speedy, a high-ranking member of the Battlebird Armada. The second issue continues the rising action, leading to the climax. Tails has to outmaneuver Speedy to find a hiding spot, and then has to outmaneuver a battalion of the Armada's forces in an attempt to rescue Bunny and Antoine. Meanwhile, Antoine is being held in his cell, while Bunny is forcibly taken to see the Battle Lord. Bunny is mistakenly believed to be a member of the Dark Egg Legion action and deep cover, so she has to play this role as best she can and keep the Battle Lord's trust. Antoine manages to escape his cell, only to be discovered immediately. Y'all can probably see how each event adds to the dramatic tension. This leads us to the climax, where the fleeing Antoine comes face to face with Bunny, still stuck in her role. Seeming to believe she is actually a traitor, Antoine throws himself out of the fortress, possibly to his demise. Now, the majority of Sonic Universe issues do end with cliffhangers, as that's the nature of comics. You need to do what you can to ensure the reader picks up the next issue, but I find that oftentimes the most prominent cliffhanger is in the second issue of an arc. Probably because it's more likely for someone to stop reading halfway through a story than they are 3/4 of the way through. Something like the sunk cost fallacy. To use some other arcs as examples, the second issue of the 30 Years Later arc ends with King Shadow being freed from stasis, while the third issue ends with the monster Chaos breaking free. These are similar events in that they are a malevolent force being unleashed on the world, but they're different in the amount of dramatic tension being presented. King Shadow being unleashed brings the intrigue of what will this evil version of Shadow do and who can stop him, while the Chaos cliffhanger tells us our heroes are gonna fight the monster. And yeah, I do want to see them fight the monster, I would like to see that, but it doesn't leave me with a whole lot of questions. A second example would be the Journey to the East arc. The second issue ends with Sonic and friends being confronted by recurring antagonists, the Destructics. The third issue, Espio's here. And again, I do want to see Espio. It's nowhere near as tense. The third issue then covers the majority of the falling action. We get to see the resolution of the climax, revealing that Tails actually managed to catch Antoine, and Bunny gets to continue playing double agent. Tails has a clear plan for him and Antoine to deal with the Armada, and you can feel the tension slowly begin to alleviate, especially when Bunny reunites with the group. This doesn't mean that they're without struggle, but it feels like our heroes are rallying against their foes. The fourth issue continues the falling action to its final resolution. Our heroes finally manage to defeat the Battlebird Armada's last-ditch effort against them, while Tails sort of earns Speedy's respect. Our conclusion is the Battlebird Armada finally being driven off, as it's revealed their base of operations was in fact their sunken flying fortress as they retreat. The denouement sees the Battlelord reprimand his underlings, establishing they will still be a threat in the future, while also setting up that the Babylon Rogues, who've been referenced a few times throughout this story, will be playing a role in the next arc. Also, Tails, Bunny, and Antoine finally get to have their vacation. In here, there's also a resolution for an emotional arc as well. Throughout the story, Tails compares himself against how he thinks Sonic would handle the situation, clearly looking at himself in a negative light. But during the denouement, Tails is given recognition for his own heroics. The arcs in Sonic Universe work really well because they have this really good flow. They're not often getting caught in asides. They're constantly moving towards the next story beat. It also has the space to actually develop its ideas without having to weirdly truncate anything. They make for very easy reads, which brings me to my next point of... it's hard to get people into comics sometimes. I think people get overwhelmed by the numbers. Manga is pretty easy. You get volume 1, you liked it, you pick up volume 2. There's an infinite number of comics with Batman in it. People give their lists of what they think the best place to start is, but honestly sometimes that is equally overwhelming. My approach has always been, is a specific storyline interesting to you? Pick up its trade paperback. Did you like it? Check what else the writers and artists have done. Are you just wanting to read comics in general? Go to the comic book store and buy one you think looks interesting. It doesn't matter that it's issue 212 and you haven't read the other 211. You'll be fine. That's how I started at least. But obviously some people don't want to do that. I also personally find it sometimes easier just to follow a single interesting character. There's usually lists of appearances out there that you can use as reference. Archie Sonic has the same problem. There's over 500 issues related to this comic's ongoing story, and people struggle to figure out where to start. Writer and game developer Bobby Schroeder runs a blog called Thanks Ken Penders that's a pretty helpful guide for starting to read Archie Sonic. And even she gives 4 different starting points to pick from. My take is, if you're interested in reading Archie Sonic, start with the Sonic Universe arc. Which one? Pick the ones that have your favorite characters in it. To me, that's the perfect vibe check for the overall book. If you enjoyed that arc, there's probably some other stuff from the series you'll enjoy as well. Almost every storyline can work as a starting point, and they're for the most part self-contained. I can think of one Sonic Universe arc where it's important to know how it ties into the main book, but it's also the only one where the main comic continuity Sonic is the star of it. So that makes sense, it's building off of the current ongoing story. Some personal stories about introducing this book to people. I have a group of friends who are comic readers, but weren't really Sonic fans when I met them. So needless to say, they weren't even reading IDW, much less Archie. But a good portion of them have started reading Sonic in some form. The first one I ended up starting a friend with was the Sonic Universe arc 30 years later. And anyone familiar with that arc is probably asking why, as this arc is essentially the finale to an alternate future timeline created by Ken Penders that was altered and reintroduced in issue 166 of the main series. Well, I didn't recommend it on purpose. We were all talking about comics that show a possible future timeline featuring the children of the main modern-day cast. You know, stuff like Spider-Girl, and I just mentioned offhandedly that Archie Sonic did something similar. And when I was asked what issues it was, I just said it was Sonic Universe issues 5 through 8, because that's the one that focuses in on the kids with our heroes visibly older. And I also didn't think anyone was going to check it out. Well, one of them did. She felt that, while she lacked context for things that may have made moments land better, she still could follow the story itself and enjoyed it. As for how she was able to do this with not just missing context for this universe, but Sonic in general, she said the sentence, "Because Ian Flynn is a better writer than Tom DeValco," which I've been reeling from since she said it. And I guess, even though I really like a lot of Spider-Girl's world, Ian's writing has definitely had a larger impact on my life. So it's a sentiment that I personally can't argue with. Honestly, comparing this arc to Mayday's first appearance, there are some similarities. Both start with brief recaps of what this world is, and while What If number 105 decides to go with a wall of text, while Sonic Universe number 5 decides to have its recap occur diegetically, their narrative function is the same, to get the reader caught up with the new world that they're about to be dropped into. With a What If, that's fairly standard, and in the case of 30 years later, that timeline hadn't appeared in the comics in 3 years. Both books show us glimpses of the wider world without losing focus of the story at hand. In the case of Spider-Girl, that sets up the MC2 at large, while 30 years later brought some attention to some of the older books. And also makes me sad that while we got to see Bunny and Antoine's kids, we never got to see what the future Bunny and Antoine looked like. The other storyline I ended up starting some friends with was the Spark of Life arc, which went from Sonic Universe number 71 to 74. One of my friends got interested in this arc because of the villain it introduces, and the other was interested in a specific character dynamic. While this was a period where a lot was going on in the comics, the arc still manages to be self-contained by being a very character-focused story. Really, all that's needed for this story to work for the reader is for them to buy into Sally and Nicole's dynamic, to feel something about Nicole's character arc, whether that be sympathy or even a resonance with it. And then it has a really solid supporting cast too. I did a video where I touched a little on Big's role in this story a while back. I am hesitant to go too much into this story because it's a really good one. It's still on my list to do a video about Nicole, so I'll probably explore it in depth in the future. So, if you're not an Archie reader, but I managed to convince you to give Sonic Universe a shot, you may want some of my recommendations in addition to the ones I've already mentioned. The first I really recommend is Treasure Team Tango, which is my all-time favorite Sonic comic arc. I will always go to bat for this storyline. Not only does it star my two favorite Sonic characters, but it's a really fun, quick-paced story with a lot going on. You've got some pretty rare character interactions, and I actually think it captures the vibes of the series as a whole, with classic and modern elements of the franchise getting to interact with each other. It's really fun. Check it out. I'd love to go in depth on this one at some point. Pirate Plunder Panic is another really fun one. Technically, it is a post-reboot story, but it's in this fun space where it's still interacting with a pre-reboot element. It's like a half step in the reboot. If you like Blaze and her world, this might be the story for you. My next recommendation is a little different in that it's a handful of arcs that all flow into each other. They are Shadowfall, The Great Chaos Caper, and Total Eclipse. I've called this group of stories a couple things: Shadow vs. Knuckles, Eclipse's arc, and you can technically fold in one more arc with Shattered, as it's following up on this story, and we get to see my favorite characters interact again. But definitely check out a list of the storylines for yourself. Silver's got 2 dedicated to him, the Chaotix got a couple. You've got options. There are also a couple of one-shot issues. They stand on their own pretty well, despite 2 of them being right before major crossover events. A couple issues do end up being dedicated to those events as well, but obviously they're best read as part of those events. Despite the last issue being printed over 8 years ago, I feel very old. I think this series has had a lasting impact on the Sonic comics. I'd argue that the 4 Sonic Forces prequel comics are similar in style to the first Sonic Universe arc, the Shadow Saga, in that they aren't a continuous story, but 4 smaller stories that follow a core theme. There are good stretches of IDW's main series where the book is broken into 4-issue arcs. Obviously, with it being part of the main series, it's not as self-contained, but I still could imagine picking up the comic at the beginning of an arc and being able to make sense of it. However, I do think the assorted miniseries IDW has done are very much the spiritual successor to Sonic Universe. Them all being 4 issues each with a similar narrative structure make me believe that while we don't use the name Sonic Universe anymore, the series isn't really dead. While we know the reason we don't have another ongoing Sonic title is the fact that Sega's team for reviewing the books isn't large enough to handle multiple titles at once, this could very well change in the near future, and I do hope we get more books exploring the rest of Sonic's world. Thank you all so much for watching. I've been working on the script for a bit, and I hope I've convinced some of you to give Sonic Universe a read if you hadn't already. I want to give a shout out to my patrons, and a special shout out to my $5 patrons, Ned Rex, Nate DM990, Diddly Do, and Queer Kaiju. See y'all in the next video.